I'd like to begin by saying that I feel very privileged to be giving this talk in the midst of such revolutionary times in this region. Today, I'll be sharing stories from my work as a journalist about individuals engaging in the revolutionary act of reimagining and recreating their worlds, and what social media and this new technology means for this age-old process. Today, I argue that the very act of connecting across these languages, cultures, and borders through this medium is allowing private citizens to imagine their worlds and communities in unprecedented, radical ways. When I talk about revolution, I prefer to focus on revolutionaries, the concerned citizens behind these monumental periods in history, the people who strategically organized themselves for change, who created mass movements of people power that commanded attention and action. Revolutionaries who fundamentally believed in and imagined worlds that did not exist. Many minds in this room might be jumping to images of Che Guevara, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Frida Kahlo, and while all of these individuals engaged in challenges to their frames of reference and imagined and worked towards worlds that they imagined as much more just and less oppressive, I'd like to begin much earlier than these modern figures with a revolutionary from this part of the world, someone you've no doubt all heard of, the Muslim prophet Muhammad. The prophet Muhammad was neither the first nor the last private citizen to turn what my mentor describes as exercises in political science fiction into facts on the ground. In fact, he did with the modes of communication and connectivity at the time what revolutionaries are doing across the globe today. The Prophet Muhammad was born in a time when the Arabian Peninsula was ordered strictly along tribal lines, and his ideas about total submission to a single God were not only radical, but also revolutionary. For my purposes, it wasn't his legacy of conquest that made Muhammad a revolutionary, but instead, it was the fundamental challenge his ideas posed to the frames of reference at the time, and that the ideas were no doubt inspired by the connectivity of communities in the region. Muhammad's revolutionary worldview not only demanded a shift in authority, legitimacy, and basic societal structures away from familial ties, but also recognized the value in the worldview of the other. In this case, the monotheistic religions of the region, the neighboring communities of Jews and Christians. Through the very basic modes of communication and connectivity available, Muhammad merged ideas from significantly different worldviews to create a radically new society. He imagined a world that did not yet exist and strategically organized a critical mass of like minds to make his dream a reality. The Prophet Muhammad turned an exercise in political science fiction into revolutionary and earth-shattering facts on the ground. Interestingly for me, it was through a revolutionary mind that I met here in Israel that I began to imagine the Prophet Muhammad in this way. This Jewish-Israeli revolutionary, Professor Nimrod Horowitz of Israel's Ben-Gurion University, first piqued my interest with his contagious curiosity for Islamic studies, and more importantly, his ability, like the Prophet Muhammad, to recognize worth in something that his society not only devalues, but attempts to erase. My mentor, Professor Horowitz, along with Israeli, Palestinian, and international colleagues, is engaged in what he describes as these exercises in political science fiction. Broadly speaking, imagining and working towards a world that does not yet exist here in Israel-Palestine. Professor Horowitz and his like-minded Israeli and Palestinian colleagues are using their historical perspective, their memory of a time when the two-state solution was a radical subversive concept, to focus on not only imagining constructive alternatives, but also building the critical mass of like-minded individuals across ethnic lines dedicated to a pragmatic peace with justice. So what does political science fiction look like in other contexts? And how do private citizens turn these ideas into facts on the ground? In 2011, the explosion of what the world's calling the Arab Spring rocked not only the Middle East and North Africa, but civil society across the globe. I dove in head first as a journalist interested in civil resistance organizing and saw that these exercises in political science fiction were happening everywhere, with the most radical and creative emerging from communities in the global south, and that the openings that these revolutions achieved were as good of a chance as any for these organizers to make their imagined dreams a reality. In Libya, I went to some of the most conservative, isolated towns dismissed by my journalist colleagues as al-Qaeda strongholds, where I met women hosting democracy workshops, in which women lawyers educated in Europe lectured about many concepts that we take for granted in our frames of reference. Free and fair elections, independent judiciary and institutions, checks and balances, and freedom of press. I met women who'd begun to demand equal participation in their local leadership councils, most notably a 23-year-old woman who imagined herself as the leader of that council. I met women who'd launched their community's first independent newspaper, who whispered that although they would allow men to work as reporters when they returned from the front lines, they were going to maintain female editorial control and ownership of that paper, explaining to me, the Western journalist, that the content will no doubt change if men are in charge, and that women will need an outlet to push themselves into the public sphere if free Libya is going to be any better than it was under Gaddafi. These women were confronting one of the most pervasive and internationally accepted structural injustices, patriarchy, in a town in which previously women were not allowed to drive, and in a time in which a violent civil war was waging continually just miles to the west. As one Libyan woman put it, a refrain that I've heard echoed across the Arab world despite the loss and struggles that these struggles have endured. Now that we've tasted freedom, we can never go back, whatever the cost. In Egypt, I met some 20-something-year-old engineers and architects working for days on end at the 24-hour internet cafe, charting and mapping and calculating the cost of their Green Cairo proposal, a plan committed to reimagining the deteriorating capital city, a city burdened under the weight of 20 million people and the pollution from that. Green Cairo, a sustainable plan to bring the capital city into the future and to reverse the gentrification set into motion under Mubarak. In Bahrain, I interviewed a young Shia banker, Ahmed, and yes, I said banker, not your typical revolutionary, who not only imagined a country in which all citizens have equal opportunities and rights under the law regardless of race or religion, but he imagines Bahrain as the Singapore of the Middle East. I've done the math, he explained to me, and the racist oppression of the majority of my country only serves to hinder our entrepreneurial potential. Most recently, I met some particularly subversive minds from Iraq, a country that at times seems irreversibly destroyed by my country's belligerent invasion and occupation. From the devastation emerged a community of women from across many ethnic cleavages inside Iraqi society. Their common bond? The violence, particularly sexual and domestic violence, that they endured almost ceaselessly, like many women, in times of conflict. They approached the reunification of their peoples, and they refused to call it Iraq or subscribe to the colonial nation-state model imposed on their people and land. Through a gender justice approach, by institutionalizing some of the most radical forms of feminist affirmative action, a totally reimagined worldview of gender justice, and a redefinition of healthy human sexuality. The government and their enemy religious sects have agreed on one thing, that these women must be silenced, stopped, that their ideas are dangerous. These women, however, say that with each assault, their movement only grows stronger. So to bring it back, how does social media revolutionize the revolution? So let's start with Egypt, a diverse country of over 80 million people who live under extreme political and economic oppression. A country in which the physical public spaces in which organizers traditionally coordinate were too dangerous. To confront this challenge, organizers carved out a digital public space and were able to cultivate a culture of resistance that they could then take to the streets. A sophisticated strategy that could have been easily torpedoed had Egyptian authorities been able to arrest these organizers in a single meeting. In other words, they turned their political science fiction, their organizing in a digital public space, into facts on the ground in what was arguably the most unexpected development of 2011. In this example and others, social media enabled revolutionaries to engage in both an exercise and an act of political science fiction, to imagine and create different types of communities than the ones in which they were previously a part. To pose a further question, if our current world order consists of these imagined communities we call the nation state, what happens when these new tools, or what happens when we use these new tools to not only imagine, but also forge new communities that we, as private citizens and individuals, define? We're already seeing this happening, this emergence of a global civil society, and not just in the Arab world. Just months ago, I was in the States when a single young American revolutionary a student, Maxwell Love, decided to begin a thread on Facebook to connect student organizers against tuition hikes. These organizers reached out online to student strategists in Quebec for a conference call to talk shop. In Mexico, while meeting with Mexico's anti-drug war organizers, the Movement for Peace with Justice and Dignity, I saw two international colleagues use Google Translate to engage in a conversation about strategies and challenges of their different movements on opposite sides of the world. In my professional work alone, each of the examples of colleagues I've given today were established or maintained through my social media networks, on Facebook, and more often than not, Twitter. So whether it's Egyptian women consulting over Skype with Liberians they met on Twitter who pushed through some of the most progressive feminist legislation in the world, or American hackers in Silicon Valley sharing resources with Iranian resistance leaders in need, new media is allowing for strange bedfellows across the globe, partnerships that would have never before been possible, and the cultivation of an arsenal of best practices being aggregated and shared across networks that have never before existed. And as the internet and mobile technology become increasingly affordable and accessible, even in the global south, the potential combinations of networks becomes even more infinite. So to close, I'd like to return to my friend Ahmed, that young Bahraini banker, after a fascinating interview in which he explained the sophisticated strategy of the Bahraini resistance. He asked me, so what's going on with the United States? Where are you guys? Now this was before Occupy, and I was pretty pessimistic about things in the States. I plunged into a rant about how the accessibility to channels of power in the United States is limited according to class, race, gender, sexual orientation, ability, and religion. And I continued with this litany of excuses as he patiently waited until I ran out of breath. He then paused and said to me, you know, my parents used to dismiss my activism and tell me that democracy was only for Americans, not Arabs, but I refused to agree with them. So you may think that revolution is only for Arabs, not Americans, but I hope some Americans disagree with you. So with that, I'd like to end with a challenge to join revolutionary minds like my Bahraini friend, to participate and implement these exercises in political science fiction, hopes of building a more just and humane world. And in a time where the technological revolution is giving us previously unimaginable tools that allow us to form our own imagined communities in ways that can circumvent race, borders, and even language like never before. As concerned private citizens, the momentum is at our backs with the tools and possibilities at our fingertips. Thank you.